The absolute confidence with which we navigate our visual reality is perhaps the greatest masterpiece of human consciousness, an unshakable faith in a world fully formed. We move through space convinced that every brick in a distant wall, every leaf on a towering oak, and every speck of dust dancing in a sunbeam exists in pristine, high-definition clarity, whether we look directly at it or not. We operate under the silent assumption that the universe is an open book of relentless resolution, an objective canvas painted down to the finest atom, stretching uniformly across the entire expanse of our gaze. This unquestioning trust forms the foundation of our sanity, the baseline from which we construct our physics, our philosophies, and our fragile identities. Yet, if we pause at the threshold of our own perception and dare to examine the mechanics of our sight with an unblinking, analytical eye, we find that this seamless reality is an exquisite fabrication, a brilliant sleight of hand executed by the neural architecture of the mind. The world we think we see is not a static, objective monument standing independent of our gaze. It is a dynamic projection, a highly localized event that requires immense computational economy to sustain. When we look straight ahead, we are anchored by a tiny window of sharp, vivid clarity known as foveal vision, a miniature spotlight of high-fidelity processing that occupies a mere fraction of our total visual field. Outside this hyper-focused sanctuary lies a vast, untamed wilderness of sensory ambiguity, a sweeping expanse where the crisp lines of reality dissolve into a fluid, monochrome smear. This peripheral domain is the forgotten borderland of consciousness, an immense territory that we routinely ignore because our attention is perpetually held hostage by whatever sits directly before us. We treat the edges of our vision as a passive backdrop, a reliable frame that holds the central picture in place. We assume that if we were to suddenly swing our attention sideways, we would find the exact same hyper-realistic detail waiting for us, perfectly preserved and fully rendered. However, this assumption is the precise mechanism of the illusion. The sensory engine that constructs our experience does not waste its precious energy rendering the entire universe in high definition simultaneously. To do so would require an impossible catastrophic expenditure of biological or systemic processing power. Instead, the mechanism operates on a principle of radical efficiency, generating the appearance of a total world only where our conscious attention is directly anchored. The peripheral visual field is the raw, unpolished backstage of this grand theater, the place where the scaffolding is exposed and where the elaborate textures of the simulation begin to fray, blur, and dissolve into nothingness. If we learn to hold our focus rigidly in the center while turning the eye of our attention toward the outermost margins of our sight, we catch the cosmic rendering engine in a state of profound vulnerability. We begin to realize that at the extreme edges of our awareness, the matrix forgets to render, leaving behind a shifting, ambiguous canvas that hints at a reality far more fluid and incomplete than we ever dared to imagine. To understand the depth of this sensory loophole, one must look at how the eye itself is mapped, a biological architecture designed for conservation rather than exhaustive truth. The fova, that tiny pit at the center of the retina, is packed with an extraordinary density of cone cells. The biological sensors responsible for capturing the vibrant spectrum of color and the razor-sharp boundaries of form. But as we move outward from this central nexus, the population of cones plummets dizzily, replaced by the more primitive rod cells, which are blind to color and incapable of resolving fine detail, functioning primarily to detect motion and shadow. This means that, biologically speaking, the vast majority of our visual world is naturally experienced as a low-resolution, desaturated ghost of a landscape. The brilliant blue of a passing car or the intricate text of a billboard at the edge of our vision do not actually exist as color or text in our raw sensory feed. They are mere mathematical abstractions, gray shapes, and rough movements that the brain actively paints over with memory and expectation. The mind is a master counterfeiter, continuously filling in the blanks with historical data, guessing what should be there based on what was there a moment ago, and generating a seamless, convincing illusion of a fully realized environment. When we exploit this loophole by deliberately practicing peripheral attention, we are effectively looking behind the curtain of our own reality. It is an act of sensory sabotage that reveals the digital nature of our existence, exposing the hidden economy of the system. Imagine walking through a vast, open-world video game where the graphics are so photorealistic that you forget you are staring at a screen. As long as you run forward, looking straight ahead, the landscape appears infinite and unbroken. But if you were to turn your character's head with unnatural speed, or look out of the absolute corner of the viewport while keeping the camera locked, you might catch a glimpse of the skybox loading, the textures popping into existence a millisecond too late, or the geometry remaining blocky and unformed until your crosshairs land upon it. This optimization technique, known in computer science as Foveated rendering, is not an invention of modern silicon engineering. It is a fundamental law of universal architecture. The universe only creates what is absolutely necessary for the observer to witness. The moment our attention drifts away from a specific coordinate in space, the system downscales the resolution of that coordinate, conserving its creative fire for the point of direct impact. The peripheral vision is the ultimate proof of this celestial economy, a living demonstration that the world is being continuously generated on an as-needed basis, popping into reality just ahead of our gaze and dissolving into a ghostly, unrendered wireframe the moment we look away. This realization shifts our understanding from a simple quirk of human biology to a profound philosophical and cosmic revelation. It forces us to confront the deep, unsettling possibility that objective reality is a myth invented by a mind that fears the void. If the edges of our vision are constantly fraying, if the colors and details we take for granted are merely placeholder data generated by our own cognitive bias, then the solid world begins to feel remarkably fragile. We are like actors standing on a dimly lit stage, convinced we are inside a magnificent palace because the spotlight shines so brightly on the gold leaf of the throne, while just beyond the beam of light lies the dark, hollow emptiness of the warehouse. By looking closely at the periphery, we invite a state of sacred destabilization. We break the spell of the comfortable, rendered illusion and allow ourselves to witness the raw, primordial chaos from which order is perpetually summoned. We begin to understand that we are not passive consumers of a pre-existing universe, but active participants in an ongoing act of creation, holding the fabric of reality together through the sheer, concentrated power of our central focus. The moment we relax that focus, the matrix slips, the rendering engine pauses, and we catch a glimpse of the infinite, unformed emptiness that cradles our fragile world. To peer deliberately into the blur of the peripheral visual field is to confront the fundamental pillars upon which the architecture of our illusion rests. The first core theme we must dissect is the principle of computational observation, a universal law that governs both the biological mind and the cosmic framework. In any closed system, whether it is a biological organism operating on glucose or a grand cosmic simulation running on quantum architecture, energy is the ultimate currency. The system cannot afford to spend its finite resources rendering every leaf in a forest, every grain of sand on a coast, and every stellar body in the night sky at an absolute level of mathematical precision simultaneously. To do so would cause immediate system failure, a catastrophic crash born of absolute data overload. Therefore, the architecture employs a brilliant methodology of dynamic rendering, creating a localized oasis of hyper-resolution precisely where the spotlight of conscious awareness lands, while leaving the rest of the canvas in a state of fluid, low-cost abstraction. The periphery is not broken, it is optimized. It is a necessary buffer zone of low-fidelity data that allows the central illusion of a solid, permanent world to exist at all. This mechanical conservation introduces a second profound theme: the illusion of permanence versus the reality of emergence. We live our lives under the deep philosophical assumption that the objects behind us, beneath us, and far to our sides maintain their structural integrity. When our eyes are turned away, we believe that the painting hanging on the wall behind our backs retains its vibrant oils, its crisp geometric lines, and its wooden frame in absolute stasis. However, the lessons of the peripheral field suggest a far more radical truth. The universe does not remain rendered in your absence. It operates on a law of strict emergence, assembling itself molecule by molecule, photon by photon, only at the exact moment of observation. When an object enters your peripheral vision, it exists merely as a wave of probability, a loose mathematical sketch of form and movement. It is only when the fovea swings toward it, dragging the heavy machinery of conscious focus along, that the system rapidly populates the sketch with high-resolution textures, solid boundaries, and rich color. The appearance of a permanent, objective world is a retroactive fabrication of the mind, a clever trick where the rendering engine always finishes building the room just a millisecond before we turn our heads to look at it. Behind this dynamic creation lies the profound concept of cognitive interpolation, the process by which the brain acts as an aggressive editor and counterfeit artist. Because the raw data streaming from the outer edges of the retina is notoriously sparse, lacking both color saturation and spatial definition, the conscious mind should technically perceive a dark, chaotic, and heavily pixelated vortex surrounding our central focus. The reason we do not experience this terrifying void is that the mind continuously run a highly sophisticated prediction algorithm. It takes the high-definition memories gathered from past central glances, combines them with our current expectations of what a room should look like, and seamlessly pastes this synthesized data over the blurry margins. We are not seeing the room as it is in the present moment. We are seeing a historical projection, a tapestry woven from memory and habit. This theme exposes a terrifying existential truth. The vast majority of our visual reality is not a direct perception of the external world, but an internal hallucination, a comfortable fiction generated by a system that prioritizes psychological stability over raw, unadulterated truth. This realization forces a re-examination of the true nature of attention, shifting it from a passive window of observation to an active force of crystallization. In traditional physics and everyday life, we treat attention as a mere camera, a neutral tool that records a universe that is already entirely there. But when we analyze the mechanics of the periphery, we see that attention is actually the catalytic agent of reality itself. It is the energetic currency that triggers the rendering engine to activate. Wherever our focus is directed, the underlying quantum foam or neural code crystallizes into hard, objective facts. Conversely, where attention is withheld, the world softens, loses its rigidity, and slips back into an unformed, probabilistic soup. The peripheral field is the physical boundary line where this crystallization process begins to fail. It is the gray area where the solid, predictable laws of our central matrix meet the wild, uncharted waters of absolute potential. By anchoring our awareness within this borderland, we begin to loosen the rigid, deterministic grip of the matrix, discovering that the world is far more malleable, responsive, and incomplete than we have ever been led to believe. To truly absorb the mystery of the unrendered periphery, we must transition from the language of mechanics into the timeless theater of allegory and myth. Let us envision an ancient, wandering cartographer who has been commissioned by an enigmatic king to map a kingdom of infinite proportions. The cartographer is given a magnificent carriage equipped with a single brilliant lantern mounted to the front chassis. This lantern does not cast a wide ambient glow. Rather, it projects a narrow, hyper-concentrated beam of silver light that illuminates a circle of ground no wider than a few paces. For decades, the cartographer travels the realm, dutifully recording the details of the world caught within that silver beam. He documents magnificent marble cobblestones, the intricate veins of exotic wildflowers, and the sharp carvings on roadside monuments. He returns to the castle and presents the king with a flawless, high-definition map of an entire continent, convinced he has documented an objective, pre-existing empire One evening, however, as the carriage rolls through a dense, unfamiliar forest, the cartographer decides to do something he has never done before. Instead of keeping his eyes glued to the center of the silver beam, he holds his head perfectly still and forces his gaze outward into the dim, shadow-drenched margins where the lantern's light begins to die. To his horror, he notices that the majestic oak trees lining the path do not possess bark or branches until the very instant the central beam sweeps over them. In the dim, peripheral haze, they appear as shifting, translucent pillars of smoke, shifting shapes like restless spirits waiting for an audience. The moment the lantern beam approaches, these smoke pillars instantly freeze, crystallizing into rough, ancient wood and sprouting thousands of crisp green leaves. The cartographer realizes, with a creeping sense of awe, that the kingdom he has been mapping for a lifetime does not exist in his absence. There is no empire out there in the dark. There is only a magnificent, responsive phantom that rushes to build itself wherever his lantern happens to point, leaving a wild, unrendered void just outside the light. Let us explore another narrative, born from the lore of the ancient weavers. Imagine a magnificent, endless gallery where a master weaver is tasked with creating a tapestry so grand that it covers the walls of a boundless palace. The weaver sits upon a moving stool, her hands flying across the loom with impossible speed. When visitors walk through the gallery, they look directly at the section of the tapestry right in front of the weaver's hands, marveling at the tight, dense knots of silk, the brilliant gold threads, and the hyper-realistic depictions of historical battles and celestial arrays. The visitors walk away singing praises of a completed masterpiece that spans miles. But one day, a curious child wanders into the gallery and refuses to look at the point of action. Instead, the child stands at the extreme edge of the room, looking out of the far corner of her eye at the sections of the wall 20 paces away from the weaver's stool. What the child discovers strikes her dumb with wonder. In those distant zones, away from the weaver's immediate focus, there is no tapestry at all. There are only loose, unspun bundles of raw wool floating in mid-air, a cloud of unsegregated colors, drifting like mist against the bare stone. The moment the weaver slides her stool down the track toward a new section, the floating mist rushes into her hands, instantly locking into tight, solid patterns, generating the illusion that the tapestry had been waiting there all along. The child understands that the masterpiece is an illusion of completeness sustained entirely by the velocity of the weaver's movement. The world we see is that very tapestry, and our central gaze is the moving stool. The magnificent, solid reality we brag about is only a few inches wide, while all around us, just out of focus, the raw threads of the universe remain unspun, waiting in a state of beautiful, chaotic grace for the loom of our attention to arrive. Consider, too, the allegory of the cosmic theater and its lone, weary projectionist. In this theater, a magnificent film is playing, depicting a hyper-realistic cityscape filled with soaring skyscrapers, bustling crowds, and neon lights reflecting off rainy asphalt. The audience is completely captivated, weeping at the drama and ducking from the passing cars, entirely convinced of the absolute reality of the city. But suppose an audience member breaks the unwritten rule of the theater and decides to look away from the silver screen entirely, turning their head to stare up at the tiny, square window of the projection booth at the back of the hall. If they look closely at the edges of that exit aperture, where the raw beam of light first escapes the machine, they will see that the film is not made of buildings or streets at all. They will see that the light itself is a chaotic, swirling vortex of dust motes, a turbulent storm of empty illumination that holds no form, no color, and no identity. The skyscrapers and the crowds only exist when that raw light hits the flat obstacle of the screen and is compressed into a localized field of focus. The peripheral vision is the equivalent of looking directly into that projection beam before it hits the wall. When we look at the outer edges of our sight, we are catching the universe in its pre-projected state, witnessing the raw, unformed light of consciousness before it is forced through the lens of human cognition and rendered into the concrete, predictable geometry of our daily lives. These stories serve to remind us that the apparent solidity of our universe is not an inherent property of matter, but a collaborative performance between the observer and the observed. The unrendered periphery is not a flaw in the design. It is a sacred intermission, a gentle tear in the fabric of the simulation that invites us to look past the movie and remember the infinite, unformed light that makes the entire show possible. When we step out of the realm of allegory and ground these insights into the fabric of daily life, we discover that training our relationship with peripheral vision holds immense, transformative power. This exploration is far more than an intellectual exercise in simulation theory. It is a practical discipline that can radically alter our psychological resilience, our physiological health, and our creative capacity. In a modern world where our attention is continuously engineered to be narrow, frantic, and hyper-focused, the peripheral field offers an immediate escape hatch. By learning to consciously defocus and hold the unrendered margins of our reality in our awareness, we can actively manipulate our nervous systems, dismantle acute stress responses, and change the way we interact with our environments. The most immediate real-world application of this practice lies in the rapid regulation of our biological stress states. When we operate in our default modern mode, staring into the glowing rectangles of smartphones, navigating heavy traffic, or obsessively focusing on a singular problem, we trigger a state of narrow visual focus known as foveal fixation. This hard, penetrating gaze is neurologically bound to the sympathetic nervous system, the ancient biological mechanism responsible for the fight or flight response. When you lock your eyes onto a single point, your brain receives a subterranean signal that a predator is near or a crisis is unfolding, causing your heart rate to elevate, your breathing to become shallow, and your cortisol levels to spike. Conversely, when you deliberately relax your gaze, widen your awareness, and allow the soft, unrendered textures of your peripheral vision to flood your consciousness, you trigger an immediate neurological pivot. This wide-angle awareness activates the parasympathetic nervous system, signaling the body that the danger has passed, lowering blood pressure, slowing the heart rate, and washing the brain in a wave of calming neurochemicals. It is a biological reset switch that requires no special equipment available to us at any moment of the day. Beyond physiological regulation, cultivating peripheral awareness unlocks a revolutionary approach to creative problem solving and cognitive flexibility. When we face an intellectual or creative block, our natural instinct is to stare harder at the problem, forcing our foveal intellect to scan the details over and over in search of a solution. However, because the foveal system is built for linear processing, historical comparison, and rigid categorization, it often traps us in the identical loops of thought that created the problem in the first place. When we soften our focus and intentionally engage the peripheral field, we bypass the critical, hyper-analytical filters of the left hemisphere of the brain. We tap into the holistic, associative, and pattern-seeking capacities of the right hemisphere. The unrendered, ambiguous nature of peripheral data forces the mind to stop relying on rigid templates and instead look for novel connections, hidden relationships, and emergent structures. It is no coincidence that historical geniuses throughout time often reported that their greatest breakthroughs arrived not while staring intensely at their work, but when they relaxed their gaze, went for walks, or caught an unexpected spark of insight out of the absolute corner of their minds. This practice also yields profound implications for our emotional intelligence and interpersonal dynamics. When we interact with others from a state of intense, hyper-localized focus, we often become hypersensitive to micro-expressions, defensive cues, and linguistic minutiae, which can amplify tension and create an atmosphere of mutual surveillance. By practicing a wide, inclusive awareness during communication, holding the individual in your central gaze while remaining actively conscious of the room, the shadows, and the unrendered spaces around them, you introduce an element of profound spaciousness into the interaction. You become less reactive to petty provocations, more attuned to the ambient emotional climate of the room, and capable of holding a grounded, non-judgmental presence. You stop consuming the other person as a hard, objective target and begin to experience them as a dynamic, unfolding phenomenon within a larger, shared landscape. On a deeper existential level, integrating peripheral awareness into your daily life functions as a potent form of deconditioning from social engineering. The modern matrix thrives on keeping your attention locked within the rendered zones of its choosing. Advertisements, news tickers, social media feeds, and tightly controlled consumer environments. These systems are carefully designed to keep your foveal spotlight trapped in a loop of endless consumption and reaction. The moment you look closely at the periphery, you are actively choosing to spend your attention on the one thing the system did not optimize for your consumption, the unformed, unpolished void. You are reclaiming your sovereign right to choose what is real. By spending time in the company of the unrendered edges, You develop a profound immunity to the artificial urgency of the modern world. You realize that the crises, the trends, and the pressures presented by society are just highly localized projections on a central screen. While just a few degrees to the left or right lies a vast, quiet ocean of absolute freedom that remains forever unwritten and untouched by the noise of human history. To stand at the final threshold of this perceptual journey is to realize that the blurred, unrendered margins of our vision are not a failure of our biological equipment, but an invitation into a higher order of freedom. We have traced the mechanics of our own sight, pulled back the curtain on the hyper-efficient rendering engine of the mind, and walked through the ancient allegories of the cartographer, the weaver, and the projectionist. We have discovered how the body and the cosmos conspire to save energy by generating a localized mirage of absolute solidity precisely where we look, while leaving the rest of our world in a state of fluid, low-resolution potential. This realization shatters the old mechanical myth of a cold, objective universe that stands rigid and complete in our absence. It reveals that the matrix we call daily life is a beautifully fragile performance, a dynamic landscape that requires the intense, concentrated currency of our central attention to remain locked in place. This understanding carries a profound, transformational call to awaken from the hypnotic spell of foveal enslavement. For too long we have lived with our eyes glued to the center of the screen, allowing our attention to be trapped by the high-definition distractions, the manufactured crises, and the rigid structures presented to us by a hyper-focused society. We have allowed our nervous systems to burn out in a state of perpetual fight or flight, chasing the crisp, alluring textures of a pre-rendered world while ignoring the vast, restorative oceans of space that frame our existence. To look closely at the peripheral vision is to enact a radical declaration of independence. It is an intentional choice to stop feeding the deterministic loops of the simulation and to start honoring the raw, unformed primordial field that cradles our reality. The blank spaces at the edges of your gaze are not empty voids to be feared or filled. They are sanctuaries of absolute autonomy, zones where the rules of the matrix lose their grip and where the universe confesses its own grand malleability. You are being called to step into the role of a conscious co-creator, shifting your identity from a passive consumer of a finished universe into an active participant in an ongoing act of creation. The soft, unpolished borders of your world are a reminder that reality is not an absolute, unchangeable fact, but an open-ended conversation between your consciousness and the quantum foam. By relaxing your gaze and expanding your awareness to include the unrendered periphery, you unlock the power to dissolve your old, calcified habits, soothe your ancient anxieties, and tap into an limitless reservoir of creative insight. Carry this wide-angle presence into the world, not merely as an intellectual theory, but as a living, breathing sovereignty within your daily life. Walk through this majestic, emerging landscape with the quiet grace of an initiate, knowing that the solid structures before you are fluid, that the rules are soft, and that at the edges of your awareness, the universe is forever waiting for you to rewrite its design.